So following up what Chaim and I were talking about yesterday, I want to talk a little bit about Midrash, specifically Midrash here in Shemot. Midrash has many goals, right? Midrash has many, many goals. And obviously different types of Midrashim have different goals, right? Midrashay Halacha have one goal. Midrashay Agadah have very different goals. But I want to focus on two main goals in Midrash, which are in many ways opposites, almost exactly opposites, but are both very prevalent in Shemot in particular. Okay? One of the central themes of Midrash, or goals of Midrash, is gap filling. Right? Is gap filling. Basically, right, the Torah is not, I know this is shocking, it's not a full account of everything that happened in the lives of every single character. Okay? I remember once one of the people who was in the call with me in Toronto, Rabbi Adam Friedman, pointed out to me that there was at least one Hasidish thinker who did not believe what I just said, Rav Pinchas of Kuritz. I think I'd mentioned him to you before, who actually claimed that the only words spoken by any person in Tanakh in their entire life are those words found in Tanakh. This is obviously insane, right? I have no idea. I honestly, look, I don't know how you think that the only words that, like, Avram ever spoke to Sarah were, hey, now I know you're beautiful, and do whatever you want with Hagar. Like, I assume there was some other conversation at some point in their life. I don't know if he thinks that, I honestly have no idea what this means. But obviously there are gaps. Now, some of those gaps are completely irrelevant to us, and that's why they're not there, right? I mean, certain gaps, who cares, right? Meaning, sure, I know what Avram served for lunch or dinner or whatever it was when the three malachim came. I don't know what he had every breakfast, lunch, or dinner. I don't know if he had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I don't know if he only had dinner. I don't know if he only had breakfast. I don't know if he only had lunch. I don't know if he was an intermittent faster. I have literally no idea. Okay? I don't know. I don't care. Nobody cares. Right? But other gaps seem to be more important. And Midrashim try to fill those gaps. Okay? Now, right, I think it's unfair to say Midrash fills all gaps, because like I said, Midrash doesn't care about the gaps that are completely irrelevant. Right? But Midrash is there to fill in gaps that do matter. Now that begs the question, if the gaps matter, why are they not filled in? It could be that they're less central to the story, but do add something. It could be that the ambiguity is God's point, right? Is that God doesn't want, it's not the historical record alone which is important, and the possibilities all have resonance, right? Some sort of omni-significance, right? Or omni-possibility or something, right? So we could talk about that. That's an interesting theological question. Whatever it was that Chazal thought they were doing when they filled those gaps, they clearly thought that the fact that God didn't fill it in was not a problem in terms of their speculating, right? It could also be that certain Midrashim have traditions that are passed down that the assumption was they were passed along with the Torah, right? That's also possible. One of the most glaring gaps in the Torah, and that's why so much of Midrash, and not just Chazal-esque Midrash, right? Not just like the classic Midrashim, Midrash Rabbah, Midrash Tanchuma, but other Midrash in the sense that non-biblical texts, right? Try to answer the question, what was Moshe doing from when he was born to when he magically appears and fights an Egyptian, right? Like, what happened there? Like, he grew up in the palace, but did he know he was Jewish? Did he not know he was Jewish? Right? Those are two very different things. Did he live in Egypt the whole time? And there's entire Midrashic traditions that the answer is he was indeed an acting prince of Egypt. And, you know, he did princely things like conquer Ethiopia and marry an Ethiopian princess. Right? That's what he did. Right? And he helped fight them off because they had snakes surrounding the city, so you couldn't get into the capital of Ethiopia, and he decided that the way to solve that was to send storks, and once you send storks to eat the snakes, then you could conquer. I kid you not, this is in the Midrash. This is, what? I don't know. Don't ask me, right? But this is central to the Midrashic enterprise in Shemot, and there's a reason that not only are there the regular Midrashim, but there's a collection of Midrash called Midrash Moshe Rabbeinu, right, which is simply about answering the questions, what did Moshe do for all those years? But Josephus has sections devoted to this, and Philo has sections devoted to this, and all early Jews who care at all about this story have some sort of description. Now, it could be that certain traditions were passed down, could be that they're imagining it, right? But it really matters to the story, right? It really matters to the story. Now, it could be that the ambiguity is the point, right? Meaning, part of the point of Moshe is that it's ambiguous. Did he know he was a Jew, or did he discover he was a Jew later? Did he grow up as a prince of Egypt, right, and reject it, or did he grow up as a misfit, right, knowing he was really a Jew? Those lead to very different sort of psychological takes on Moshe's personality. Right? Just very quickly, Chaim, right? I mean, one possibility is, no, the reason he ends up being the enemy of the Egyptians is because he always knew he was a Jew, and Bat Paro told him, or Yocheved told him when she was nursing him, or I have no idea, come up with however you want to tell this story, right? And that's why he saves the Jew, and that's why he's the perfect person to fight against Egypt, because he's, the rejected son who grows up in the palace knowing that he's an outsider, and when he finds who he belongs to, so then he's the natural enemy of the Egyptians, right? That's like one tale you could tell, right? The absolute opposite would be, no, he thought he was an Egyptian, right? And when he's then rejected by Paro, that treason is what helps fuel his being God's emissary of fighting the Egyptians, right? Or the middle, which is my preference, and I've talked about this in the past, which is that, no, maybe the reason Moshe needs to be who he is because you want someone who is, as the Ibn Ezra would have it, is regal, right? The Ibn Ezra says he needs to be Jewish, but he needs to be regal, right? That's his first point. His second point is no one respects people that they knew since they were a kid, right? So he needed to be Jewish, but he needs to grow up away from the Jews so they would never respect him, right? You can't be a rabbi in the shul you grew up in. It doesn't work, right? Oh, look, it's so cute. He's giving the drasha. It doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. Oh, look, he's bringing them the Ten Commandments. It's just bad dynamic, right? Just bad, right? We always knew you would do great things. Like, that's not what you want, right? Or, I think even more pointedly, it's important that he sympathized with both sides, right? Because as, right, the Beit Yosef's preferred Midrash, right, that the reason that we're supposed to feel compassion for the Egyptians also, right? We're not supposed to be happy that they're dying, right? So the only person who could successfully feel sympathy for the Jews, but also realize that this is not good versus bad, but actually do what needed to be done while embracing the complexity is someone who grew up as a prince of Egypt, right? And therefore identifies with the Egyptians, even the palace, even Pharaoh, but is also Jewish, right? But the question of what happened in those gap years, and did he know he was Jewish, and how much was he integrated into the royalty, is important for trying to figure this out. So the Midrash is trying to answer that question. Yes, Kai? Maybe. Nope. It's machloket mefarshim whether Echav is the Egyptians, right? The Ibn Ezra notes it's a machloket. It's ambiguous, and that's good. We'll end this section with that ambiguity, which is the mefarshim note that he went out to see Echav, right? But the mefarshim note, who are Echav? The Jews or the Egyptians, right? It's not clear in that pasuk, right? Very good. In a few psukim, it's clear, and that's exactly the point. Did he already identify with the Jews as his brothers, right? Or, no. He was identifying with the Egyptians and came to identify with the Jews. That's the ambiguity that's very important to the psukim. Very good. That's the $1 million question that Midrash is trying to answer. Very good. Second point, and this is what I was talking about, Chaim, is that sometimes Midrash does what I just said, which is it closes the gaps. But equally important is that sometimes Midrash does something much more ambitious and maybe even subversive, and that is it opens the gaps. Yes, it creates gaps. Right? It creates gaps. What? Sure. I think that closes the gap because, I mean, it opens and closes at the same time. It says, imagine what happened in those 40 years. That is closing a gap because, you know, right. And yes, you open a lot of stories, right? Now you can have, like, you know, fan fiction about Moshe Rabbeinu and follow up on those stories. Great. But it also does something. So what I mean by opening gaps, so this is, I mentioned this to Chaim yesterday, this is how Aviva Zornberg opens her book on Shemot, but it's a very powerful point. Chazal also do the following. If you read Shemot and you read the Torah, so fascinating, it's great. We think we know what happened, 40 years in the desert, etc. Chazal do some sort of radical things, like Chazal say only men died in the Midbar, and the women made it into Israel because they never sinned in the Chet Egel, the Chet Meraglim. Right? Aviva Zornberg points out that that's Midrash doing the opposite. It's saying, right, that's Chazal saying, you think you know what happened in the 40 years? That's not true. You know the story of the people who died, i.e. you know the story of the men. Maybe you didn't realize there was a gap that needed to be filled. So let's just throw out a little fact, which is that you actually don't know what happened to the women. So you want to know what happened to the women? Right? The Midrash opens the gap and says, the Torah doesn't tell you that story, now go figure it out. Right? And Chazal play on this because they do this in the Mitzrayim story. Because what do they say? B'schut nashim tzidkaniyot. In the schut of the women, we left Mitzrayim. Where are they getting that from? Because once they've opened up one gap, and they said they didn't sin in the Egel and the Meraglim, so then they say, that must be part of their personality in Egypt itself, is they were different than the men who ended up dying. So what did they do? And then they start telling more stories to fill in the gap that they've now created, which is, they must have been responsible for making sure the Jews procreated because they knew they were going to go out because they actually had faith. So they came up with the mirrors. Right? The Midrash of the mirrors, right? That they would hold a mirror in front of them and their husbands and say, who is more good looking? Until their husbands were aroused, and then their husbands would sleep with them and they would have children even during it. And then they bring those mirrors to Moshe Rabbeinu to put it in the Kiyar, and Moshe says, I don't want these are about arousal. And God says, no, those are the best. That's what I want in the Mishkan. Right? And they build up these Midrash on Midrash. Right? I mean, once they've opened one gap, they open another gap, and then they tell stories. There's no gap there. They created the gap, right? And then once they created the gap, they build an entire world, right? They build an entire world. In this week's Parsha, right? What do? They say, Miriam. We know that Miriam watched Moshe, but we already have this whole theme going that the women are the reason they left Egypt. We have another story. She didn't just watch. Her father divorced her mother, right, and said, Paro is killing the children. And Miriam said, no, you are worse than Pharaoh because he's only killing the men. You're preventing anyone from being born. He said, you're right. And they got remarried because Miriam, at the ripe old age of 6, had a prophecy that her parents would give birth to the Savior. You understand, right? Chazal are opening a gap, and then because of the gap, now they are filling in the gaps that they have themselves created to tell stories, right? Right? So sometimes Midrash closes gaps, but sometimes it notices that there's, not a gap, there's just something that is silent, so they open a gap, right? I'll throw out one more example from this week's Parsha, right? You could have, as we mentioned in the last 2 days, said that the Jews didn't work every day, all day, and that's why Aaron seems to have a little bit of freedom of movement, right? Chazal say, no, Shevet Levi was never enslaved. Suddenly you open an entire story, which is, well, if Shevet Levi wasn't enslaved, then what exactly did they do for 200 years, right? For 210 years. And Chazal come up with stories. What are their stories? Amram was the Gadol Hador, and Aaron was the Gadol Hador before that, and he was supposed to be right, and Aaron was the leader, and that's why Moshe could say, send, right, when he says, Shlach na b'yad tishlach, send who you send, what did Chazal say? send Aaron, who's been busy leading the Jews. He's already used to it, right? They start telling stories. Oh, if Levi wasn't enslaved, they must be doing something. What are they doing? They're probably leading them. That's why Moshe can say, send it with Aaron. Oh, Aaron was already the leader? Aaron is the Levi? Oh, wait, so he's the Levi, so what does that mean? That means Moshe must be supposed to be the Kohen. Oh, but he doesn't want to be the leader, so it must have flipped, right? Meaning these stories are not filling in gaps, right? They are creating gaps, which they then need to fill, right? So I think it's important to recognize that Chazal do two very different things. Sometimes they fill in obvious gaps, like, what did Moshe do for a long time? That's a pretty obvious gap, like, what did he do? But sometimes they say, there's a gap you didn't see, let's create it, and then they start, right, telling you historically, theologically, whatever you think they're doing, right, what emerges from that, and one gap that they've created leads to 100 others. And these are two very different goals. Both of them have the same purpose, which is to fill out the story of Tanakh, right, or the possibilities, right? And this is always, the last point is that it's really the possibilities, right? Meaning, I think it's inescapable to say that if the Torah doesn't say something, then Chazal think that the ambiguity is part of the point, right? Is that you're supposed to be able to tell different stories, right? There isn't one right answer. I think that's central to the Midrashic enterprise, okay? But as Aviva Zornberg correctly notes, in Shemot, this is particularly pointed, right? In the Egypt stories, these are particularly pointed, and that should be something, you sort of keep your eyes open for as we go through, okay?